Firstly, thanks for joining in. I'm Mark Webb, Future Purchasing's Managing Director. With me today, I've got Dan Crease, who is the ex-head of third-party supply management at HSBC, and also Mark Hubbard, a fellow director at Future Purchasing, and Mark's going to be collating the questions and managing the technology. We're going to keep it to 30 minutes. We're going to keep quite succinct, focused on this topic. But Dan and I will stick around for 15 minutes at the end if there are any specific questions that people have got and things that we can particularly help with. So if we can move on the slide, Mark. Thank you. Future Purchasing, we've been around for 17 years now. We're very focused on category management, supplier management, procurement transformation, and negotiation and stakeholder engagement. We work across all sorts of sectors, and this is very much in the heartland of what we do. We build supply chain resilience into category strategies and also supplier strategies as well, very related to that. So how did we arrive at this topic? Well, a couple of weeks ago, we ran a session on negotiation, which Mark led, and one of the most popular follow-up topics, in fact the most popular, was supply chain resilience. So we got in touch with Dan and asked him to write a blog for us, which he very kindly did, and we thought we'd run through that today, some of the key points from that in this webinar. So the purpose for you to ask questions that you're particularly interested in. We'll run a poll a bit later on to get your feedback on where things are now in terms of the very torrid environment that we're all operating in. And there will be an opportunity to run through very quickly for a few people the template, which is something we'll talk about later on as well on a one-to-one basis for people who decide to take part in that. So, Dan, over to you in terms of a bit about your background, if that's okay.
Brilliant. Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you everybody for joining the session today. So as Mark said, I'm Dan Crease. I'm former head of third-party management at HSBC. I've actually spent most of my career in procurement and supply chain, and most of that's been in financial services, predominantly Barclays and HSBC. I've led many aspects of procurement and supply chain, so category management, outsourcing, through to supplier performance management, supplier relationship management, risk, and then more recently focused specifically on third-party management, which brings a lot of these topics together. Just a few words on HSBC. Really remarkable organisation to have the privilege to work for. It's colossal in its size. It can be complex. Certainly in the region of 40,000 plus external suppliers, 30,000 users of the system that we put in place, and across 65 countries, so the regulatory landscape is super complex, but a very great culture to do it all in, which when we talk about a little later, did facilitate a lot of the work that we had to do.
Excellent. You mentioned there the phrase third-party management. I haven't heard that before. We'll talk about supplier management. Some people call it supplier relationship management. How did you arrive at that particular term?
Yeah, it's interesting. From a procurement point of view, we're serial users of our own terminology, and sometimes forgetting the fact that can be difficult to understand for other people. At HSBC, one of the things I realized was it's such a large organization to get people, to help people understand it better. I brought together the concepts of supply risk, supply management, and contract management, because really, in reality, these are just things that my stakeholders needed to do in order to safely put a third party in place. So calling it third-party management was just almost a marketing exercise to an extent, but it greatly simplified the topic. When we said that, people knew it was those things. So that helped hugely. That's the main reason why we use that terminology. I think also the fact that many of the topics within third-party management, of course, are so interrelated. It's quite important to talk about them holistically, at least sometimes with people. Otherwise, they get confused about what it's really about as a subject.
Yeah, and did the organisation, was it taking third-party management seriously at the time, do you think? Because you were the first person into that role, weren't you?
Yeah, so yeah, we created that role within the organisation. I was originally heading up supplier management and outsourcing. Again, disparate parts of what is ultimately the same topic, and was a good reason for doing that. Yeah, the organisation was absolutely taking it seriously, like all banks were. But I think, as I was saying before, unless it's clearly articulated strategically, people aren't really sure which bit they have to fix in order to fix it as a subject. So if you put that against all the other competing priorities that a bank has, it does become difficult for people to know exactly which bit to go sort out. So yeah, it was always taken seriously, but I think taken even more seriously once it was better understood.
And any sort of takeaways from those sort of years that you spent there? Because it's quite a few years as well that you were doing there, wasn't it?
Yeah, I guess there's probably three things. A reminder to me of the breadth and complexity of the subject. And as I've said before, it's really best not nibbled at. Don't go and try and fix the risk bit without thinking about the contract bit, without thinking about how the thing's going to be managed in BAU and what operating model sits supporting it all. I think the second one is boards and the really senior folk. They're worried about this subject. You know, it's quite noisy, especially in the regulatory world. And they're really willing to do something about it when they understand it. So clearly articulating that is fundamentally important. I guess the final one, I have my boss to thank for to an extent, which was you really can design and implement a global tool across 65 countries in 9 months and go live on one day. Which to me at the time when we were designing this and looking to put it in place seemed impossible. Yeah, with the right encouragement and the right team, we actually could do that. So that was a hell of a learning.
And what sort of tool was that you put in place?
So we put in place RSA Archer, which was effectively it's a workflow tool. Our team in the US was using it. They had lots of regulatory support and approval around the use of that, having had a number of, like a lot of US banks, regulatory findings. Made sense for us to do the same with the rest of the organisation, albeit we put a different instance of Archer in place for the entire group versus the US. And really it was a consistent workflow tool. So it enabled a person in the business who wants to use a third party to accurately and consistently assess the inherent risk, the residual risk, ensure it gets contracted for appropriately, and then the tool had built into it all of the actions and required control tasks that are needed over the term of the engagement. And of course, you can run some fabulous MI and data off the back of this, which is half the challenge, is actually showing people where their highest risks are and what needs the most attention and management. So yeah, Archer enabled us to do that.
And that was part of the overall sort of environment that you created for third-party management. What else was in the scope of that? Yeah,
so a policy, our colleagues, we have 3 lines of defence in financial services world. First line is the owners of the risk, effectively, the businesses and functions. Second line tends to be policy level and the risk specialists. And third line is audit, just for those listening who are not in financial services world. So we're making sure that there was an appropriate policy in place and the governance and controls around that. The operating model is pretty fundamental. So right roles and responsibilities, job descriptions, centralized team to enable and make this happen. We had an onshore and offshore team that we created for that. We touched on it before, the consistent risk assessment and ongoing management process. Appropriate due diligence and contracting, a way of segmenting that supply base at the time where you actually put the engagement in place, so you understand its relative importance to others and what would be needed in post-contract. Service management and supplier management, the basics of that. And then really the most important part to an extent is the data MI and reporting. And I use the analogy of shining a light on a dark corner. When you really do understand the risk associated with your supply base and you've got great data and you can understand how well it's being managed, it's an enabler. It's a huge enabler.
Because that's a massive organisation. We haven't talked about this. How many employees, how many people touched suppliers?
Around 30,000. So I think we trained 15,000 on the new tool pre-go live. Wow. In that 9-month period, or certainly in the last couple of months before going live. But we used a network of champions to enable us to do that. Folk that were using the tool already, or the previous tool that was in place, which is a very, very basic, almost Excel-based tool. I touched on earlier the culture. HSBC is very, very good in that regard. People want to do the right thing and try to do the right thing. So you come across very few challenges, and the challenges you do come across are normally merited in some form or other, which really, really helps. But no, 250,000 or so employees across 60 plus countries, so an awful lot of people. But it's that regulatory landscape that really makes it complex, because what we put in place was standardized. It was HSBC's view of this is how we should do this. And I was quite adamant that we did that, because otherwise we'd end up playing a game of chasing our tails, really trying to solve for whatever the latest whim, if you like, or point of view is from a regulator. So they're important, but I'm not going to solve for them centrally. Centrally, I'm going to give you the HSBC way of doing this. Locally, you can make little adaptations where necessary. But it's surprising how it's just consistent, really is.
Yeah, I mean, that's a heck of a task with that many people. That's more than 10% of the workforce touching suppliers, which is not unusual, but it's such a big number. To try and bring some coordination to that must have been pretty challenging. What were some of the key ways that you achieved that, do you think?
Well, a pretty much hand-picked and remarkable team to work on it for that year in particular, in 2017. We also, I think one of the most important things was the communication, actually. And a word we all band around and talk about. In an organization that size, the communication has to be phenomenal, but incredibly simple. So simple, consistent, regular, planned, and timely communication across the COO network, the chief operating officers across the organization, and subsequently to their teams. And it's interesting, actually, a lesson learned for me in 2018 was we'd done such good comms in 2017. You could go to any corner of the world and ask any COO what was going on, and they knew what was coming up next. 2018, we had so much data to work through and all sorts of back catalogue stuff to work through. We didn't do the comms as well, and it's incredible how quickly the story starts to change around where the bank is on third-party management and that sort of thing. So a really important lesson learned there, to never take your eye off the comms.
You can never do too much.
No, absolutely. Too much. Yeah.
So just looking at the supply chain resilience piece and what was in the blog, how would you recommend that people prioritize the suppliers to focus on? If you were in that sort of role that you were in, now, how would you go about finding the suppliers that you really need to be looking at in detail? Yeah,
I mean, thankfully, and most banks will be in the same boat. Because of the regulatory scrutiny that we've had as our dependence upon third parties has grown over the last probably 10 years or so. We are in reasonable shape on aspects of this. We do know who our most critical services and suppliers actually are, for a number of different regulatory reasons, not just on third-party risk per se. Alongside that, with the maturity of risk assessment that we also have, most of us have segmentation tools, and we have a good understanding of how those suppliers are managed and great data to do so too. So if I was in that role at this moment in time, I could turn to reporting that would tell me, and those that own these relationships, where our most critical relationships and engagements actually are and who with. And typically these are in ops and IT, and that's why ops and IT tend to, in financial services in particular, be a little bit more mature on this topic overall. Yeah. So it'd be a question of, talking to them about, did the business continuity plans that they'd put in place and DR plans, are they working? What's happening in the critical supply chains? What kind of risks are emerging? What are the tier one suppliers telling us is a potential threat or concern? Equally, where we're not getting that information, it's why. What have we not asked? What have we not been doing correctly? And as I said, that would be the same for pretty much any organization that has done some work on this already. What about where, most people have, and obviously an understanding of tier one, most people have done it in certain areas down further beyond tier one. What if somebody hasn't done that at the moment? What's the way that you would go around looking at those beyond tier one suppliers? Well, I think the first thing to do is And it doesn't need to be scientific, but understand which are your most important services. What's the stuff that keeps the lights on? What is core to what your product or service actually is? And I think most organizations have a good view of that, if not scientifically, intuitively. I think then it's going to those organizations, those if you like, tier one suppliers, and starting some dialogue with them around the supply chain. Ask them about the tiers beneath it, ask them about critical subcontractors. And when I say critical subcontractors, ideally these are tiers that are identified pre-contract that sit beneath the tier one that are fundamentally important to the provision of the service or product. In fact, ordinarily, if it wasn't for the commercial relationship, you may be contracting with them directly to do that. And these suppliers are fundamentally important. We'd expect to an extent contractual controls and flow downs that you have with the tier one to flow down to the tier 2 and 3. We'd expect the tier 1 to be managing them appropriately. We want to understand how they're doing that. What kind of questions do they ask? And that sort of thing. And there's an awful lot you can dig into to understand that stuff better. But the starting point is ask.
Yeah, and is that part of BAU type of approach you'd recommend, sort of getting into those discussions as a one-off, which you'd have to do now, obviously, but would you recommend people ask those questions? You mentioned pre-contract, actually.
Yeah.
Getting into that level of detail.
Completely. This has got to be habitual and routine. I suspect off the back of this pandemic, an awful lot will change around the nature of conversations in service and supply management. Where this stuff was being done reasonably well, the conversations about service, it's about KPIs, it's about data, it's about escalations, incidents, and maybe cost and quality as well, depending upon obviously the nature of the sector and service or product in question. I think now it's really going to be switching and pivoting towards business continuity, towards resilience, towards reducing complexity, towards understanding where future risk may lie. I don't think any of us, I certainly never did business continuity planning for a global pandemic in my career. I don't think any of us imagined this, bar a few organizations perhaps around the world. And therefore, I don't think anybody's necessarily prepared for this in that regard, but it will certainly exercise our imaginations on what could go wrong and subsequently what we should know about our supply chains.
So it's definitely worth having a checklist of questions for those tier 1 suppliers, I guess, to start to probe those, and also not with your current suppliers maybe, but also with potential suppliers as well, as people reach out beyond that, those current ones.
I'd immediately build in some checklist questions pre-contract as part of the due diligence process to find out about that right now. And as you said, then make sure that we're asking appropriate questions of the existing critical suppliers.
I think when we review people's category strategies, we definitely find that this is possibly one of the tool areas that people are less comfortable with, and that the outputs typically aren't as strong as in other areas. So something definitely to build a capability in, I would have thought.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, if I think back through my career, and I'm sure many of the folks on the webinar can relate to this too, business continuity is not something we paid lip service to, but it just wasn't the most important thing, because I'm not sure any of us could imagine something worse than a natural disaster or a building outage of some sort. So we never really went beyond that. So interestingly, if we only ever did that and we did it pre-contract or just after the contract and then never reviewed it or tested it, I'd imagine the business continuity plans that are in place and trying to be used right now aren't great and aren't really that fit for purpose. So I certainly think it's making us think pretty differently about business continuity in that regard.
Yeah, one of my colleagues was mentioning this week when we were talking about the webinar that they had a situation where one of their suppliers had a business continuity plan, but when tested, I would say, about it and asked more deeply, confessed that they hadn't really tested it themselves and weren't overly sure it was going to work. So that sort of going the step further rather than ticking the box, definitely worth doing in every case.
Completely right. And it's going beyond business continuity plans as well. It's scenario planning. And it's actually thinking about, when you think about supply chains, very often, they interrelate to other types of service that ultimately links to a particular product. So it's about bringing supply chains together. That might involve multiple suppliers. That might involve internal services. And actually starting to scenario plan with internal and external colleagues around this. It's incredible how much is revealed around how much you really need to think about. And it doesn't mean you have to, double up on everything and throw a whole load of cost into all your contingency planning. But you'll work out for you and your sector and you and your organisation your tolerance around this. And tolerance, I think, is a term we're going to hear a lot more of. I think it was yesterday, the Financial Conduct Authority, so for those in a regulated world, apologies for those not, but was making clear that, supply chain resiliency and operational resiliency are going to continue to be important topics. But in particular, they're looking to understand the organisation's perspective on the most important services, the levels of disruption that may may occur under different scenarios, and crucially set a tolerance for that, which I think is interesting. Starting to think about, well, how much disruption am I willing to accept? And I wonder what the pandemic's going to teach and show different organisations in different sectors about that.
And just in picking up that point, the business continuity plans, a lot of people in obviously stressful situations at the moment. Would you say it's worth revisiting those at the moment and seeing what else might happen? I'm just wondering, for people who've got those in place, what do you recommend?
I think it's a great time to do it. I'm not sure there's a bad time. Other than the fact that if your business is not in a continuity form, i.e. you're in serious trouble, if you've invoked some business continuity and you are stable, and you can, I think it's a great time to take a review of the scenarios that are playing out now and note them for now and for later, because there's a lot. Most things we don't know yet, I think, as professionals in this space. The indirect implications and the knock-on effects of different things are going to reveal some fascinating case studies over the next few weeks and months. The implication of that factory there not being open, being able to do so and so, a byproduct of it created this, that did that, and there'll be an international shortage of a particular commodity or an ingredient. These impacts are really not well understood.
So well worth getting into those now and starting to play those out. Your scenario planning piece, I think, is absolutely fundamental.
Yeah.
I'm conscious of time. I just wanted to finish off this section before we get to the questions with your views on what organisations should do as a first step, if they've not done too much so far in this space, and what more evolved organisations might do as well.
Yeah, to an extent, it's going to depend upon the individual firm, the sector, whether they're regulated or not, and then of course how impacted they've been so far by the pandemic. But I'd certainly say, organisations that haven't done too much around understanding their supply chain should really do that. Really ask those questions if they're tier one suppliers, understand who your critical, what your critical services and critical suppliers actually, who they are. Maybe run a diagnostic around some of your TPM, your wider third-party management aspects as well. I think for more evolved organisations that have done more of this, I think revisiting business continuity plans, making sure that the due diligence that you're doing up front is picking up on critical subcontractors and maybe even reviewing supply chain complexity. And again, a diagnostic of third-party management really helps, because you can ultimately tell a story about where you are in your maturity that's much easier to then tell to other people, come up with a roadmap of remediation, and secure funding and support for it.
Excellent, thank you. Mark, would it be okay to pull up the slides again, and we'll quickly look, just a reminder, thank you, of the templates that are available for a download. It's actually one piece of a how-to guide, which is that piece for PCBs, just to show you how to construct a supply chain map. And then that allows you to see who are the suppliers involved in this and The next one shows how you then would map out for a particular supply chain and a particular element of that. If we can go to the next slide, from the organization across the left, tiers 1 to 4 there, and some of the key questions and the data you'd want to capture, particularly in this case down at the bottom, supply chain, supply risks and issues. Other stuff in there we typically look at market dynamics, alternative suppliers, etc. So that is for a generalized time you would do this, not particularly now, because now the focus will be much more on supply risks and having definitions, which most people will have, of different types of supply chain risk and identifying those for the different tiers. So that's available. That's available on the FP website. So, and also I think Susie's putting a link on there now where it can be downloaded. So if we move on one more, just to finish off on the recommendations that we put it both into the blog that Dan wrote and also we mentioned now. Mapping your key supply chains using that template as a starting point for that, and then the diagnostic. On the supply chain mapping side, if anybody, we said the first 10 people that ask us, we'll do a 1-hour one-to-one just to talk through the template, the how-to guide that we've got we can share as well, just to help people do that for an example supplier and walk people through it so you get a good understanding of it. So please let us know, email me if you would like that, nweb@futurepurchasing.com, and you can also test some other things with us during that sort of consultation. So with no further ado, questions. Mark, though, I think you've got also an opportunity here to do a poll. We've got some questions for a poll. Just want to let us know what those are and how people can fill them in.
Yeah, the poll has just launched, so you should be able to see that. 3 simple questions to have a look at. Once we've got some answers in, we'll show you the poll results out of that. We've also got a few questions just to try and get through. I'll just try and paraphrase a couple. One from Alan talks about how do you build the concepts here into the category and probably supply relationship strategies that you're building. And my twist in that one, having read Alan's question, is, and how does that differ if you're in a monopolistic or low leverage situation where you haven't actually got much control over the supplier?
So, yeah, so happy to have a go at that. I mean, as I said before, these things are all very interlinked. You know, if we have a good understanding or an understanding of supply chains that sit within category plans, then actually it's a really excellent piece of the jigsaw to have in play and in place. It will help with future procurement decisions. It will help with understanding the risk associated with particular categories and particular category strategies, if you like, as well. And similarly, from an SRM perspective, as I said before, making this stuff a routine part of dialogue for complex critical supply chains, not everything. I think that's how these things fit together. To the point around monopolistic, it probably matters even more. So just because you don't have necessarily the perceived ability to influence heavily and change those supply chains, understanding what you would do under different scenarios, again, back to the business continuity and DR piece, really, really matters. So, Mark, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think the putting this into the category strategy, typically in step 2, data gathering step, and then using it as a creative process to look for alternatives, because the idea was mentioned there about monopolistic situations. Well, a lot of the time it is because you're going to have to look for substitutions, bringing in new entrants, all those sorts of more radical options, which again plays into value levers, which we'll be covering in future weeks. but it really starts to get people being more creative and writing it down and show, well, how do other people deal with, what is their supply chain? How do we gather enough competitive information to be able to show our own internal team, or really co-develop with them preferably, what the alternatives are? So I think it's always a work in progress. In a monopolistic situation, there is rarely a silver bullet. In a supplier, the only thing I say on supplier management, it's exactly the same, because we've had supplier strategies created where the reaction has been, when they've looked at it, as actually we need competition here. A closer relationship isn't the preference. That isn't always the answer, but often it brings it to life for people that actually we maybe boxed ourselves into a situation that isn't in reality. And we put ourselves into this box. We need to be thinking about what we do to move ourselves out of that into a more competitive environment, because we put the constraints in place. Conscious of time again, Mark, is there any other questions? Because we're at 2:30.
Yeah. Two things just to mention. The full template is available on the links in the chat. So if anyone hasn't seen that, there's a link in the chat about a third of the way up from Susie Hudson that gives you the link to get hold of it. So if you can see that, that's great. I'll just show the poll results up now. I'm just going to end the poll so everyone knows, just so we can have a quick look at where that comes in. So this is the poll results are now being shared. Just for everyone to get a sense of that, what percentage of your key tier 1 suppliers are the lower tiers understood and risk assessed? Not known 40%, less than 25%. Covered is 35%, so the vast majority of people haven't got a lot of coverage in that area. Given what you've heard today, are your supply resilience plans adequate? Neither agree nor disagree.
Move that down the screen, Mark, because we can't see it quite as much as you probably can.
Has that helped you? I can't see what.
Actually, we can drag it as individuals. I beg
exactly.
your pardon.
Yeah. Disagree and neither agree nor disagree is 75%. And are your business continuity plans being effective? 55% agreeing, 10% neither agree nor disagree. So quite a spread there, just to give a sense of what's out there. There are other questions that that we've got about how do you get to control down through levels tier 2 and 3 in particular, where that's being particularly difficult and challenging. So that's one of the large ones that we haven't touched on at all here.
Okay.
There's a couple of others that we've got that we might be able to get back to people with some commentary on, because we can.
I'm happy to do that if that would help people.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So we will stick around now for 15 minutes for everybody else who would like to leave or needs to leave at this time. Thank you for joining us. We'll send you the link, as we say, on the onto YouTube. But Dan and I will stick around now for another 15 minutes, and we'll try and pick up some of those other questions. And feel free, if you're around, to ask other ones as well. Mark, which is the next one you'd like to direct us towards?
I guess the really interesting one here, which hadn't occurred to me, which is how has no deal Brexit planning helped organisations prepare in this pandemic? Which I thought was quite a nice twist. Lots of people in the UK have been looking at the impact of Brexit anyway, and doing a lot of planning work in there, which is looking at supply chains to a large extent and trying to understand the impacts upon them. But that is actually a different set of risk, I guess.
Yeah, I guess it was down to the, a lot of organisations and people that we spoke to, and the also the press and general coverage would indicate that because people didn't really understand what the risks were, they decided to plough on and see how it all played out. Was definitely some sense from certain organisations. But it definitely raised the profile of risk planning, and all of the stuff that was done in 2019 definitely started people to think down that route and put resources into it, build up stocks, all that sort of activity, and knowing how they would ramp up stocks in the short term. But in a lot of cases, demand's gone down. So that's a slightly different twist on all of this as well, because that would have been an economic impact of Brexit potentially. Dan, any thoughts from you on that one?
No, nothing more to add. exactly what you said, Mark.
Interesting one. I think there is one worth looking at here. It gets covered in a couple of areas. How can tier one suppliers affect lower tier suppliers when they are often smaller and with limited strength and capability within them? Are there any particular recommendations that are in there? And tied into that, there's also one which is how important is that in automotive or manufacturing compared to in services-based organisations such as finance?
It's a really great question, and again, to your point there, Mark, it really does vary depending upon sector, without question of a doubt. But I think some of the same principles do apply. So this is why it's important to ask tier ones questions around their own supply chain management practices, the extent to which information flows from them through to their tier twos and threes, the extent to which they help and develop their tiers 2 and 3. And by the way, I should strongly add what role you or we as the customer organization, perhaps at the top of the chain, can do to facilitate that. Because very often there's behaviors and practices that we're doing that are inhibiting tier ones to do what they need to do with tiers 2 and 3. So I think, a catch-all answer would be start the conversation and it becomes more evident. Mark, have you got something to add to that?
Yeah, it's the obvious one, pay people quicker. We've had some of our clients, particularly in the public sector, they're paying very rapidly. Now it's not on invoice receipt, but it's approval. And we've got the other end where we've got clients who still insist on 90-day payment terms because everybody else. It's a tedious discussion for many times for clients, I know, because they've been given this challenge from the CFO. So it's not straightforward, but it's absolutely, cash is what's going to kill a lot of businesses, the lack of it. So paying people more rapidly is going to make life a lot easier, and it's going to be necessary because you can't have the speed at which government loans are being given out, certainly in the UK, is slower than people would believe, I imagine.
Great, thank you. Another one, this is a really interesting one. Someone's asking, effectively their organisation is developing its whole supply chain capability into a more advanced format, developing SAP, data analytics, so that they're building capabilities. How would an organisation like that, which perhaps still has a number of steps of development to work on, how would an organisation like that try and tackle this subject area?
Well, I think if they're putting in place systems and infrastructure to facilitate capability on the topic, then a lot of the things that we've talked about in the last half hour would really help. If we go back to those basics, the foundations, if you like, this stuff only works if people do use the tool. They understand their roles and responsibilities, what they're accountable for. The right governance is in place. The data and MI off the back of it is useful for people. Things like that. And that's some of the mechanics of it. The comms again becomes very, very important. As does making sure that everybody who needs to be involved in it is actually involved at the right time. There's nothing worse than having gone 70% of the way there and realize you've missed a bunch of risk areas out or particular stakeholder groups. Mark?
Yeah, no, I think that plus, and technology plays a role in this, obviously, and there are systems out there which allow you to start to look at supply chain risks, but it does tend to be generalized, and I think there's no real replacement of the questioning of suppliers and key account managers, and really going into depth, and not just key account managers, because it's actually the operational team as well. How does it all work? All that information that you can gather out from those individuals by, sitting down with them. And obviously it's a two-way exchange. If you don't, and this is one of the common criticisms, is big organizations don't tell their suppliers very much, typically. It's a stereotype, but you still hear this in any survey you read from suppliers. So I think the questioning piece and building up your own understanding, because that is going to be far more rapid a test for supplier resilience than relying on data, which may be actually quite old as well. So, the indicators are there. What are your orders looking like? What are all the risks that you're managing? And because the first answer you get may not be the right one, and it's probing and asking questions, open questions as much as you can, and sharing knowledge with other people in your organization so that you're collating. And this is one of the things I think we often find really helps is the basics of governance, having a supplier management structure in place where you've got everybody together, because at the moment you will want those teams meeting every day on key suppliers, and they will be, what do we know, what are we finding out, what is production looking like, what is delivery looking like, etc. But the questioning side of it, I think, should never stop. It's not used as much as it should be, which is pretty crazy, really, because suppliers are the best source of lots of ideas and knowledge, not just in their own organisation. They'll know other stuff as well that's going on in their sector.
And I think that answer, Mark, lends itself well to another question I saw pop up on here around assessing suppliers' financial position during this time. Again, to your point, I think it does come back to ask. One of the best ways is actually to ask and find out what's actually going on. But
as one of my old bosses had this thing of, well, let's just offer them a discount or see what discounts they offer for rapid payment. That will bring out some of where the issues are, where people will bite your hand off and offer something that you would question. Why do you need your cash flow is really struggling if you're offering that level of discount for immediate payment?
Yeah.
Can I suggest just a quick question in here, which is, given suppliers' financial situation is changing daily, or indeed is completely broken already, what can be practically done to assess a supplier's financial position and identify and mitigate supplier failure risks? So I think the interesting bit of that is, given a lot of the reporting we get is late and slow and historical, how do we assess current financial risks with suppliers?
I think my answer before is the one I used.
Happy with that one.
Just trying to flush out who wants to, because that is an immediate, where people are having crises meetings. But again, I'd open that one out to the group as well, if there's anybody that's got other views on that.
Yeah, that's good. That's good.
Sorry, Dan, I talked over you. Is there anything you'd add to that?
No, not at all. I was just going to say, I think that's the one we just answered, but yeah.
Yeah, good. Thank you. I think I've picked out the details that we've got there. Yeah, that's pretty good. Can I just ask quickly if everyone could just start their videos?
Those of you that
everyone who's left, or there's quite a few here. This is just for a gallery view shot, just for entertainment. See what happens here. Just so you can see that we all are actually real people, because it's a bit hard after about 2.5 weeks at home to remind ourselves that there are lots of us in the world.
It's nice to see everybody, actually. I was stuck looking at Mark, you see, so
yeah.
So this is all a lot better. Yeah. Okay. So if everyone could wave all at the same time, that'd be fantastic. Brilliant. Thank you for that. That was really good. Sorry, Mark. Hijacked you there.
Yeah, no worries. So yeah, that's it. Thank you, everyone. Do let us know if you'd like a run through of the template. Happy to do that for the first 10 people that ask us. And we'll let you know when the YouTube video is up. And we will be running other webinars, and there are other blogs going up on the FP website on relevant topics. So please let us know if there's any topics you'd like to be covered as well. Thanks very much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.